session of the Energy Symposium. Usually you'd have Fred or maybe David or somebody else, or Carrie. Where's Carrie? There's Carrie. Oh, sorry, Carrie. We'd have any one of them introduce the guest. However, the guest today happens to be a personal friend, certainly a colleague from my Exxon Mobil days. And she has a rather interesting experience that we thought would be a good one to share. So let me tell you a little bit about her. Her name is Carla Lacerda. She was born in Brazil, aptly now working as the president of our Exxon Mobil Brazil affiliate, building our upstream position in Brazil. I got to be careful about keeping say our, but that was my company. She came to U.S. to go to school. She got her undergraduate degree at Florida Institute of Technology in chemical oceanography, and then she went lamentably to Texas A&M to get her master's degree in the same subject. However, she was smart enough to direct her daughter to UT, and her daughter is sitting right here in the audience. So there is a little bit of redemption for her. Carla has worked in a bunch of different places around the world. We've worked together. We worked together particularly a lot in Brazil, and that was trying to position the company for growth in a very, I would say, not unstable, but a volatile political environment, one that was changing quite a bit. And so this talk is really about how you build a business with a multinational company in a political environment that's subject to a lot of change, especially where the business is long-term business. So Carla has many redeeming qualities. The main one, well, there are many, but I'll say the main one is that if you can't get along with Carla, you cannot get along with anybody. And so really as a result of this, she has been able to leverage her ability to work with people to all sorts of leadership positions in Brazil. There's an alphabet soup of associations that she presides over, as well as her leadership position, of course, of the Exxon Mobil affiliate down there. So with that, let us welcome Carla.
Here we go. Okay. It turned green. Can people hear me? I'll bring this a little closer. Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. And I really, really appreciated working with Richard and his leadership. In fact, so it's an absolute pleasure being here at UT for this symposium. I think I'm still a little bit low, but so Richard did obviously, gigged me a little bit for being an Aggie, but that's okay. At the end of the day, I'm just, as a follow-up to Richard's little intro, is I did study at A&M for my master's degree, and as you can imagine, when you're in a master's degree program, it's kind of like head down, nose in the books, or in the lab, time to do hardly anything. So as a consequence, I didn't even go to a football game in College Station, believe it or not. But I have been to a football game here at UT, probably sitting up in those nosebleed seats right there in that corner. But it was really cool. Putting that aside, again, a pleasure to be here. I thought that this would be an interesting presentation just from a standpoint of looking at Brazil as a case history. When we look at the last 20 years of Brazil, we can see the ups and the downs of what worked and what didn't work from a perspective of attracting investment. And so it really, to me as an industry player, as well as to government or the student body, it's always interesting in terms of what are some of the lessons learned that come out of us looking back and what can we then think about going forward. So I'm going to walk you through the ups and the downs, and then I'll end here on a bit about Brazil as it's entering this energy transition in sort of our objective, our global objective of going to a lower carbon footprint. Before I start the presentation, I would like to say there are a number of graphs and slides here that were generously released by the Brazilian Institute of Petroleum called IBP, which ExxonMobil is a member of, and I'm also a member of the board of directors. A little bit about Brazil. Many of you likely know a lot about this, but largest country in South America, and also the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world with over 200 million people. 200 million people is a large market. So when we look at some of these other aspects here, it ranks somewhere between 7th and 9th in the world on a number of different aspects of sort of economic measures. 9th in the world in terms of economy and GDP. 8th largest electricity producer in the world. And I'd like to take a pause here and just say that over 70% of the electricity in Brazil is hydro, meaning very green. Now, it doesn't mean that the future for Brazil is going to continue in that amount of hydro, because most of the dam sites, or the prime dam sites, let me put it that way, have already been taken. So as we look to a projection of the future, Brazil is likely to depend more on gas-fired power gen than necessarily building new hydro dams. And if I look at the consumption of refined product, I think this is another unique aspect of Brazil. So you can see what the ratios are of transportation fuels there, gasoline and ethanol. Obviously a lot of diesel because there's a significant amount of truck transportation. Brazil is underserved by railways. And then there's also some CNG, although this number is small, but most of the taxi fleets in the large urban centers are all fueled by CNG, or a large portion of CNG. But I'd like to come back to the gasoline and the ethanol. What's not calculated in this number here is the fact that every liter of gasoline that is sold also contains 27% ethanol versus the 10% that we have here in Brazil, in the U.S. I forgot where I was. So at the end of the day, when you back calculate this, it's somewhere between 20 to 25% each in terms of component, which is very unique. And in fact, this ethanol program got developed in the 80s when Brazil was trying to reduce the imports of product from overseas. And it also began developing the technology for flex fuel cars. And so many of you may have seen flex fuel cars here in the U.S. A good part of that technology was originally developed in Brazil. Now as we go to the oil and gas sector, and I mentioned Brazil in terms of the 20-year time frame. So if we go back to 1998, when we called it round zero or round zero because of the partnerships with Petrobras, really the only player in Brazil up through then was Petrobras, the national oil company of Brazil. Highly capable company, very well qualified. Many people, in fact, studied here. Fred and I were just talking about this. Petrobras has a long tradition of geoscientists and engineers studying here at UT and then going back and working in Brazil. And so with this, developed a significant amount of deep water technology, particularly for that area that is in pink, and that's the Campos Basin. And the dominant production comes from what's called the post-salt, and I'll talk to that here in a little bit. But significant amount of technology development, and they were really pushing the limits and have won several OTC awards, in fact, due to that technology, the new technology developed. At that time, about 1 million barrels a day. So fast forward to 2018, now we have many new players. I think right here you have approximately 10 companies, many companies with repeated blocks. A lot more offshore infrastructure. You can see many more gas pipelines. Those are the ones that are in light blue. And significant amount of more of production, now 2.5 million, maybe close to 3 million barrels a day. So the opening has really helped Brazil from a standpoint of adding new players, new infrastructure, as well as increasing the production. Now, to date, most of the production is still in the hands of Petrobras, but that may change going on in the future. Going on now, I mentioned post-salt and pre-salt. Sorry, I didn't even talk about pre-salt here because what happened in this case, on the right-hand side, the traditional oil-producing area was the pre-salt of Campos Basin, which is up to the north, and it really has migrated to the south, called the Santos Basin, where the predominant production there is the pre-salt, which is much different but much more prolific. So let me explain that. The post-salt tend to be all deep water sandstone and turbidite systems. So I don't have a pointer here, but you can see more or less right in here by this layer, all fairly deep water, and it ranges from shallow water to deep water, but pretty straightforward production, although it required some deep water technology. And the source rock, for those geoscientists in the room, the source rock are lacustrine source rocks from underneath the layer of salt. The fields tend to be smaller relative to the pre-salt, so they range from hundreds of millions of barrels to the largest, which is 3 billion barrels, called Roncador. One of the reasons that they're smaller is that the oil had to migrate from underneath the pre-salt, look for some salt wells, look for some faults to be able to migrate into the post-salt reservoirs. However, in the last 10 years, a significant change in Brazil from a perspective of finding a new play, which is the pre-salt. So two things that really happened that made a big difference. The first one was the improvement of imaging in seismic. So you can see the seismic line here on the right-hand side. Due to the thickness of the salt, in some places it's 2 kilometers thick. With the prior technologies and the algorithms of reprocessing seismic, it was really difficult to penetrate that salt and have an adequate image of the prospects underneath the salt. So you couldn't really tell where you would be drilling. Now with improved imaging, as you can see, you can really delineate much better in terms of what's underneath the salt and be able to target your wells in a much more as precise way. The second thing that also happened, as you can see, is really a lot of technology goes into the well planning. And as you can imagine, the first few wells that went into the pre-salt, having to face 2 kilometers of salt, not knowing if the salt was going to be brittle, if it was going to be elastic, would the well bores maintain consistency. So those few wells really were testing the limits of drillability, if you will, in this area. And fortunately, they encountered some really fantastic fields. And now through the learning curve, these wells have come down significantly in terms of costs. So when we talk about the size, approximately 30 billion barrels of oil in the pre-salt have been found. That number is likely to be conservative. That's more or less a 2P number. You can see some examples of some of the largest fields there, Lula, Libra, Búzios, all in the 6 to 10 sort of billion barrel range, and these are all recoverable numbers. So world-class, prolific fields. Not all of them are this size. These are the 3 largest ones. But what really makes this play work is the deliverability of the wells. These wells are producing very high rates for deep water wells, 25, 30, some over 40,000 barrels a day, and sustained. So that's really what makes these pre-salt fields viable in our current oil prices and with the costs that we need to incur to drill these wells. Now, let's see how the pre-salt ranks globally. This is a chart that depicts all of the liquids that have been discovered in the last 10 years. And the gray bars represent the unconventional. So you can see oil sands, you can see tight liquids, obviously very large bar, 100 billion barrels, more or less. And to the right, you see the conventional liquids in the colors. Brazil is here depicted by the red bar, approximately 30 billion barrels discovered in the 10 years. Then as I go to the first blue bar to the right-hand side, it's the next 5 countries all together. Then the next blue bar, it's the next 10 countries altogether, and so on. So you can see the significance of Brazil here. If we look at the conventional liquids, Brazil represents something like 40% of what was discovered globally. So very, very huge amount on a relative basis. The other point I wanted to make on this slide is the fact that tight liquids and the Brazilian pre-salt were discovered at about the same time, but they have very different production profiles today. Tight liquids are producing somewhere between 5 to 7 million barrels a day. I don't have a precise number, but it's in that range. Brazil today, from the pre-salt, is producing 1.5. So one could say, why such a big difference? And there's really a couple of reasons. One is the tight liquids have a very large number of companies, small to medium to large companies as players. And I learned this from working with Richard in the days of the unconventionals. And so when you have such a large number of players, as well as infrastructure that is a lot easier to access, and rigs, et cetera, cheaper rigs, it makes sense. In the case of Brazil, it was more challenging. There was only one player, not a lot of investment. And so here is when we start the oil policy part of the discussion for today. Because had the policy been a bit different, potentially Brazil could have been today producing even more or have a larger contribution. So let's look at then the 20-year time span that I mentioned to you. We've got a timeline here from 1999 through 2018, and you can see that every bar there represents a bid round. With the dark blue colors, meaning these are areas or blocks awarded to Petrobras, and the green is awarded to anyone else, right? IOCs, small companies, anyone else. So and it's really divided into more or less 4 phases. A competition phase early on, then a concentration phase that you can see a larger, many more blocks awarded to Petrobras by the blue bars. A big gap and no bid rounds happening, and I'll explain why. And then a return to competition over here on the right-hand side, which is what really has fueled a lot of the recent investments. So why this difference? And that's where we talk about the policy, which is the photographs of the presidents on the lower side here. In the early days in competition, Fernando Cardoso was the president. And so he was center-right, really a lot more in terms of opening the oil and gas sector, because he had a drive to increase competition and reduce imports. Then in 2003, we started seeing a transition, and even before then, to President Lula, who many of you may have heard of President Lula, who was very popular at the time, comes from a leftist party. And really he had a different ideology, and that is to have more state control over the oil and gas sector, particularly after the knowledge of the prolific pre-salt plays. Then continuing on with President Dilma, she more or less continued his same policies. So we had a period of approximately 13 years there of state control over the oil and gas sector. Her presidency was interrupted due to an impeachment. So in 2016, Michel Temer took over, and that's when he came in with another sort of open door policy for private investments and foreign investments. So that more or less explains a little bit about what happens. And during that hiatus of 13 years that I was mentioning, it was not even driven by oil price, because if you can look where the little barrel is, if you scan to your right, you can see that there were some periods where oil price was over $100 a barrel. And so one would think if the drive was to promote investment, bid rounds would have happened during that period of time. That was not the case. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is cut these phases in pieces and then talk about each one and then end on why the turning point. So during the competition phase, As I mentioned, a major principle was to end the dependence on foreign oil. And why was that a problem? Brazil was just coming out of a decade and a half of hyperinflation. So every dollar that had to be paid for anything imported translated to a very high cost to the country. So the intent was, let's open to competition and see if we can increase Brazil's oil and gas production. Brazil then established a regulatory agency called the ANP for oversight of activity. That was important because with a regulatory agency, it determines timelines. It tells there's a period of time that wells need to be drilled, that appraisals have to be done, development plans have to be implemented. And so that really helped drive the fact that the companies needed to really explore, appraise, and produce their blocks. Otherwise, if they weren't doing the work, the block got returned back to the government. Brazil established a concession contract regime, which is a tax royalty regime, very similar to what we have here in the U.S. Very successful today. There's over 350 concession contracts that are active in Brazil. And also began developing the domestic market, the goods and services, through a biddable local content requirement. Now, at that point, it didn't have minimum and maximum, but there was an intent to say, if we're going to build production, we want to build our domestic goods and services industry as well. Brazil has very onerous taxes, import duties, VAT duties, etc. And so when you build that package in terms of analysis of the fiscal terms, it's very onerous. And at that point, Brazil was beginning to lose its competitiveness relative to global projects. So Brazil implemented then the Repetro, which was really a tax regime for the oil and gas sector that brought Brazil into competitive fiscal terms, and it was attractive for foreign investment. And then finally created an R&D commitment as well in the contract. Now, going to the concentration, there was a little bit of a transition to making local content more restrictive, creating fixed minimums and maximums, and the issue there is that particularly the minimums were not achievable. So the local goods and services did not accompany the policy that was being forced on it, and actually it just fell apart. It was very clear that the capacity building wasn't being successful. Petrobras also had a supply chain monopoly, and the government began using Petrobras for public policy purposes. And finally, there was lack of high-quality acreage in the bid rounds that just weren't attracting the IOCs and private sector. So now we go to the gap years. The gap years here, as I mentioned, there was more state control of the resources, and there was a philosophy or an ideology that by creating a production sharing contract, that the state would have more control over it. And for foreign investors, PSCs are something that are normal, and that there are many countries in the world that have PSCs, and that IOCs and other industry players invest in. What was unique about Brazil was the governance structure, because it had a very unique operating model that was untested, and it made investors then, it added high uncertainty, and investors at that point were not really willing to really put in a lot of effort into getting into those opportunities, what few there were. Mandatory operation of Petrobras in the pre-salt area, which was that polygon area that I mentioned. Hiatus in bid rounds, and then as you can imagine, when there is a lot of higher royalties that are being provided to the state, it also triggers a lot of discussion and lack of alignment in the government between federal, state, and municipality. So that triggered a lot of discussions in terms of how these royalties were going to be divided. and that created delays as well. So we come to a turning point here. And what were the drivers for change? And this is something that is probably in more of your recent memories if you've been sort of reading some of the newspapers that are happening in South America. 3 things happened in Brazil. First is there was a change in paradigm. There was very open disclosure of the corruption that was happening at the time. And with that, public opinion was very clear that old practices were no longer acceptable. People really wanted a change. The oil price dropped, and so significant reduction in the state revenues. If you can imagine an urban city like the city of Rio de Janeiro, who is highly dependent on royalties, and that it puts at risk, shall I say, a lot of the public services that the state then wasn't able to provide in a full way, and that's police and hospitals, schools, etc. It became very difficult for Rio State to continue providing all of those services. And the economic crisis that was happening at the time, which was really largely driven by the reduction in commodity prices. So the conclusion of those 3 things, it was really an unprecedented unemployment in Brazil, the highest to our knowledge in recorded in history, 13 million people. And really that number has not changed that significantly even today. The consequences to the oil and gas sector were that it caused Petrobras financial constraints. It was severely in debt. It had over $100 billion in debt at the time. So that caused it to rethink its investment plan, cut back on its capex, focus on reducing operational expenses, focus on efficiency, and also divesting some of their assets to be able to equilibrate this and renegotiate debt. So in 2016, the government realized at that point that the oil and gas sector could be a leverage that could help spur economic development. However, there were some barriers of investment that needed to be changed at the time, which were addressed successfully, as I'll show here in the next chart. But what enabled the change, and it was really unprecedented in how quickly it happened, was the fact that it was alignment. It was probably the first time in many years that we had alignment between the executive branch, the Ministry of Energy, the president of Petrobras, the general director of the A&P. They were all working in sync on this vector to open the market and provide investment opportunities to the private sector. So the return to competition, these are some of the aspects that were addressed. Relaxation of the restriction of sole operator. It didn't go away. Petrobras has the first right of refusal to operate and have 30% minimum in the pre-salt. But there are many opportunities that were awarded to date without Petrobras being a mandated operator. There was reduction in local content to achievement levels, so basically those minimum levels that I had mentioned earlier were more or less reduced in half for exploration and development phases. The extension of this tax regime that I mentioned, Repetro, it was going to expire, or it would expire now at the end of 2019. But because these are investments for the long term, it really needed to be extended to 2040 to enable then the fiscal terms to be commensurate with the level of investment and globally competitive projects. Brazil then resumed the bid round calendar, and then very importantly, high quality acreage were included in these bid rounds. By high quality meaning true geologic pre-salt opportunities were now available, because if you remember that gap, they were not available to industry even if we had wanted to invest in the pre-salt. So what did this all do, right? And when we say about returning for competition, well, first of all, it provided quite a bit of revenue to the government. So over $7 billion US went into the government coffers in terms of signature bonus. And you can see here, although the numbers are in local currency reais, but you can see that there are a number of players. There are 8 players here that increased their acreage in Brazil, including Petrobras as well. And this represents something like 30 or 40 additional blocks that were awarded. And really, most of these were in the pre-salt. But if we take this a step further and we look at it in terms of what does this look like for the future, if you look at the top charts, you can see from 2000 to 2002, those are industry investments. Petrobras is in the green, and other companies are in the blue. So you can see the actuals up to that dip, but as we go forward, we expect to have investments that are even greater than we had in the past. And we also see that the blue component in those bar charts are much higher, meaning a lot more in industry investment versus Petrobras. Obviously assuming the success of the exploration acreage, but this is, I think, a very high potential, higher probability of happening. And as we look at employment, which is the lower chart, more or less the same story. You can see the background, the actuals, that dip, and as we go forward in 2020, there's a number of 873,000, if I'm not mistaken. And that number may actually be conservative because for every one person that gets a job, either direct or indirect, there's probably 4 or 5 that benefit from that increased salary and the increased financial stability. I mean, personally, we have heard similar stories of how the quality of life of families improve upon having stable employment. So it's a really good news story on where we are with Brazil, and I think there's a positive vector in terms of what these discoveries may represent, not only in investment but as well as job growth. And so here what I'd like to do is depart a little bit and talk about the future of the energy for Brazil because of this large pre-salt resource that is there. This is a chart that many of you have probably already seen. It's essentially a depiction of the oil and gas production through time, going from 2015 to round numbers 2050, and it's broken into 3 phases. So the first phase here in this blue background is really indicating that, and there's a number of models that you see here of different companies and different agencies. And they all more or less agree on the phases. Now, the slope of the line could be different. But if we look at the first phase here and the first blue on the left-hand side, I think that we all agree that the world is still highly dependent on oil and gas, and the consumption for oil and gas will continue increasing up through a certain time. Then there's a window maybe between 2030 and 2040 where it will begin to flatten out. Still some dependency, but the growth will stop increasing. And then the blue on the right-hand side is it will either flatten or will really begin decreasing in terms of the demand for oil and gas. So where is Brazil now is in this first window right here on the left-hand side. This is the window that Brazil has today in terms of investing for long-term cycle projects. If we look at the longevity of these contracts, these are 25 to 30-year contracts. So the discoveries that are happening here in the 2020 or 2025 timeframe really will migrate post the end of this blue, but the idea is to try to maximize the production if possible and the value generation to the country in terms of employment and in terms of revenues. Now,
could you tell us the vertical scale?
I don't have that, and it was deliberate just to depict sort of really the phases is what was the intent of our discussion, but that's a good question. Yeah. I'll see if I can track that down and
That's always
send
one
it
of
on.
those.
The chart on the left is probably something that you may have seen already, and it's basically on the vertical axis, it's the UN Human Development Index, and then on the horizontal axis, it's energy use per capita. And you can see the range. The OECD countries are plotted in the blue dots. The non-OECDs are in the red. And you can see obviously that the OECD tend to cluster in the upper right-hand quadrant, with the non-OECD sort of a large range. And Brazil is somewhere in between. So it still is a country that has room to grow from a perspective of Human Development Index as well as energy use. And as we look at to the right-hand side, we can see it in terms of future projection. Now this is global on the right-hand side. This is really energy-related CO2 emissions. It's a projection. It's an estimate. So we can see that between 2000 and 2040, it continues to increase and then eventually flattens out. That sharp increase between 2000 and 2020 is largely due to China. But Brazil is somewhere likely to be in the red zone of non-OECD countries in the short term, pending the choices that it makes going forward in terms of new energy uses, which leads me to this slide. If we look at today, put the bar on the right-hand side here, just hold that thought for right now. All of the other bars here are more or less the energy matrix of these various countries in the year of 2016. So Russia, China, US, India, European Union, and Brazil. So you can see that Brazil's energy matrix is very clean relative to these other areas, and it's almost 50% renewable, not quite, between 40 and 45% renewable. Obviously a lot of that due to hydro. And if we look at Brazil in 2040, there is an expectation that Brazil will continue having more or less the same clean energy matrix. And so what will likely happen as we look at the pre-salt resources that Brazil is sitting on is it will produce these hydrocarbons. It will obviously supplement what it needs in terms of its demand. But the likely probability is it will export to the other countries that is needing and demanding more oil and gas until they can equilibrate their energy matrices as well. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is I just sort of walk you through the different cycles that the Brazil went in. It opened to global competition and regulatory oversight in the early days. It increased production growth. It went through this cycle shortly after that of restricting competition. Oil price dropped, unprecedented economic crisis, and that created the driver for change. The reopening of the hydrocarbon sector then was really the turning point, which then brought in new investments, and so the blocks that were awarded then in 2017 and 2018 will become, hopefully, the new pre-salt developments of the future. However, and as Richard mentioned here in the intro, companies that are investing in oil and gas really have to think through long term, because we need to be able to weather the storm and weather the ups and the downs, because once you make an investment decision and you begin developing a field, you need to be able to count on that field producing until it reaches its natural depletion state. So long-term investments, very important, because these are high capex and significant infrastructure needs as well. And finally, I'd just like to say that the future production of Brazil, really, it has this window of opportunity in the projected energy transition timeline that I just showed you. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
So during the gap period,
Sorry, where's it? Yeah.
no, you're good. So during the gap period, do non-state oil companies such as Exxon Mobil refocus their assets and capital and kind of energy on different regions, or do you continue to maintain that focus on Brazil in hopes of a regime change like in the future?
That's a good question because we don't have a pool of money, say, reserved for Brazil. And basically, we would be looking for other global opportunities in the meantime if they were competitive from a return perspective. Now, having said that, we never lost hope in Brazil. And so I'm kind of a witness to that, is the fact that we were continuously checking and trying to maintain a country presence as much as possible because we were thinking that someday it would turn around, similar to how it did. But you are right. During that gap period, we refocused, and there were other investment opportunities and other investments that the corporation made.
Yes. Has the new administration in Brazil indicated any change in either petroleum policy or the promotion of wind and solar?
So, excellent question. The new administration has indicated continuity for the oil and gas sector, maintaining the bid rounds. They haven't changed any of these policies that I now just mentioned. For the wind and solar, I think they will continue, maybe not at the same pace as maybe they were projected in the past. But there are many companies, in fact, oil companies as well, that are investing in wind and solar. And there are new electricity rounds that are happening in the future that also have a component of wind and solar in them. So once they're put into this bid round and there's a regulation, if you will, that a certain amount needs to come from wind and solar, it's going to stay. Sanctity of contract is something that we can say in Brazil has happened throughout the time. They've never really reneged on any contracts once it's signed.
Hi, so I'm not sure if this is the right question because I don't exactly understand what your specific expertise is, and so maybe this might be a bad question. But you mentioned that when you're talking about the downturn that Rio was like particularly dependent upon subsidies, or you maybe made it seem that there's maybe parts of the economy that are more dependent than others. And so I'm wondering, how are royalties redistributed? Because like in the U.S., I kind of imagine like if you're outside of the state boundaries offshore, it just gets chucked up to the federal government, and then they kind of spend it wherever they want it to a certain extent. And it's not like a super localized placement of revenue. And so in Brazil, is it different? In that, is there more localized placement of the revenues from the royalties?
Yeah, so the royalties in Brazil have a division in the law. There's a certain amount and a fairly large component that goes to the federal government, and then the state that is facing the production gets some, and then the municipality that is facing the production gets some. So that's in the tax royalty regime. What happened was, when the government created the production sharing contract, it pulled quite a bit of that investment into the federal government. As I was saying, it was more of the state control. So the states and the municipalities began losing ground. And that's what generated that discussion.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you for the nice talk. So you showed us the projections of how Exxon is going to potentially increase investment in Brazil, right? And you also mentioned that if there's other attractive investments elsewhere, that might not happen, or might not happen as big as you guys want it to be. So given that Exxon has had big success in Guyana or in the U.S. onshore with the unconventionals, do you think those projections still stand? Like Exxon will continue to bring jobs to Brazil and continue investing in exploration in Brazil? Or?
Yes, Exxon will, in fact, which is a big part of my job. So we have acquired now 26 blocks offshore. Most of those are in the pre-salt. And so we will have several wells that we will be drilling either ourselves as operator or with our partner. Petrobras is our key partner. We're going to be drilling anywhere from 6 to 8 wells between now and the end of 2020 or beginning of 2021. So the answer is yes. This talk was really more sort of generic industry, but we are one of the largest acreage holders now, and we'll continue working in Brazil. In fact, we're expanding our presence there.
Maybe a little more specific version of that question. Can you give us a feel for at least the range of what your all-in production cost or break-even cost is going to be in the pre-salt?
I don't have that information handy right now, but
Well, I assume it's competitive or you wouldn't be doing it, but what is competitive?
yeah, I would say it needs to be competitive in sort of a $40 to $60 world. Because we don't know we certainly, it behooves us not to plan in a $100 world, right?
I think I looked at a basically break-even curve, cost of supply curve, and our Guyana discoveries ranked as a lower cost of supply resource. Of course, they're being developed. They're in an even better fiscal regime. But I want to say that Brazil was somewhere in the neighborhood of 38. Pre-salt was somewhere in the neighborhood of $38, $40 a barrel.
And that's consistent with the number that we hear, say, from Petrobras and maybe the ANP.
So how long does it take to develop the fields, to really go from signing, I guess, the lease to production? And then what's the depletion curve look like for this type of resource?
You were right. We should have put in a cash flow chart in here, and I couldn't find mine to add it in here. So basically, it takes, and it ranges depending on the resource, et cetera, but it takes 3 to 5 years to complete your exploration program and get your appraisals done. And while you're doing that, you're contracting FPSOs and facilities. So probably by the 6th or 7th year, that's when your production will begin, once you get your FPSO on site, et cetera. And the production curve goes on, obviously, depending on how much more infill drilling you have, if you have any redevelopments. But it takes 25 years, at least, for the production to sort of reach its peak, and then you begin declining. Then you have to evaluate if you're going to be able to do any enhanced oil recovery or any additional drilling with that. Some of these fields, like those 6 billion barrel to 10 billion barrel fields that I mentioned, that's pre-salt, those are fields that have 8 to 10 FPSOs planned on them. It's a lot of FPSOs, which are floating production storage offtake platforms, which are sort of floating cities, really, like a floating refinery. And each FPSO costs something like $2 billion. So it's just a lot of facilities built into that, and each facility has anywhere from 8 to 15 wells, or potentially more, that need to be drilled to tie into them.
To give you a sense for the cost of these wells, it's dropped a lot, and a lot of it due to work that Petrobras and other companies have done to improve efficiencies of drilling. But the early wells drilled in these early discoveries were $200 million wells. Those exploration wells. So incredibly expensive, and at that time risky sort of proposition.
Last number I heard without completion is in the 70 to $80 million range, a development well.
For development wells, yeah.
Hi, Carla. I have a question. Over the past bid rounds, we noticed in Brazil that many major oil companies try to become a partner of Petrobras, but in the bidding, they did not submit like any offer, maybe because they were not a partner with Petrobras. And I would like to ask, what do you think are the advantages to be a partner of Petrobras, and what are the challenges to be the operator, without partnership with Petrobras? I know that Exxon's both will be the operator without Petrobras and with.
So that's a good question. In a bid round, bid groups naturally come together, and in some bid rounds you can compete against a company, and in the next bid round you can partner with the same company. So some of the advantages of partnering with Petrobras is the fact that it knows the pre-salt very well. It has a long history of producing and developing the pre-salt. So from a regional perspective, it may have a regional geology understanding as well as an understanding of the reservoir behavior and how facilities and the well development, if you will, the development plan, what could be some optimum ways or some alternative ways of building it. The advantage of a company operating a company like ExxonMobil is the fact that we can bring our global learnings and best practices and operating capability from other places in the world where we have developed them. And diversity, you know how you've heard of how it's best to have a diverse group because the ultimate product comes out better? It's not that different in a consortium drilling and producing an oil field, because sometimes diversity in your bid groups as well as your operating capabilities, you get the strengths of what each of the companies can offer, and you ultimately have a better, more cost-effective or a quicker, accelerated project. There's many different ways of really enhancing the value of the project. I hope I answered the question, the fact that we as ExxonMobil can bring some of our Guyana experience, some of our Angola experience from deep water, bring it into Brazil if it makes sense.
I've read several articles about CO2 storage capacity of numerous Campos Basins fields, such as like the Barracuda field. Is that something that Brazil nationally is involved in, or is that just smaller operators who might be involved in something like that?
The CO2 storage to date hasn't been on a large scale. And you may have heard that the Santos Basin fields have quite a bit of CO2 in them. Some of them do. There's a field called Jupiter that has up to 80% CO2 in the gas phase of one of the sections. So ultimately, but not all of the fields have that much. I'm giving you kind of an extreme example, and some of them have no CO2 or very little CO2. So CO2 management is something that needs to be really thought of. One of the challenges, back to your question, is Campos is so far north from where there could be probably larger sources or supply of CO2 in the Santos Basin that is further south. And so building pipelines, for example, is not something that is a viable option. And so I would say that that's still being looked at, and it's not happening on a large scale. But there are some companies that are beginning to think about what are some of the potential solutions to CO2. There's been one project in a depleted field called Merluza in the Santos Basin. You probably remember that one, Richard. In fact, that is a project for, it's a gas storage, but if it doesn't work for gas storage, it might work for CO2 sequestration.
One of your later slides, you showed some profiles for investment going forward and jobs going forward. And there were some pretty aggressive numbers there for potential local jobs. Can the local labor force respond to that, as in the trained labor force will respond adequately to support that?
I think so. In the short term, definitely, because of that unemployment number that I showed you. In the medium term, there may be some retooling that may be necessary. But certainly in that time frame that I showed from 2018 to 2022, likely that can be workable. Now, much beyond that, there may be some additional programs, et cetera, that need to be. The unemployment is so high. It just saddens me because, I'd get into a taxi in Rio. You get into an Uber, and when you start talking to the person, they'll start telling you their life story, right? I used to be an engineering tech on a platform. I used to be a security or safety, inspector, and on and on and on.
Okay, I don't know if there are any remaining questions. I don't think so. So with that, I would like to thank Carla for coming to Austin to join us and for a really interesting talk.
Thank
Thanks.
you. My pleasure.